thank you all for coming to this very special major issue lecture series webinar. I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center. And as most of you know, the Ashbrook Center is an independent educational center located at Ashland University here in Ashland, Ohio. We run programs on campus for undergraduates in history and politics and political economy, but also run programs across the country for students, teachers, and citizens. Our mission, as many of you know, is to strengthen constitutional self-government by helping to educate our fellow Americans in the history and founding principles of our country. And today we have a very special opportunity to talk with someone whose words have helped to shape the course of American history. I don't think that's an exaggeration to say that. This webinar is part of our mission to engage in this educational enterprise. And at Ashbrook, we really do believe that education is not simply about information and definitely not about indoctrination, but about discovering the truth. As I often say, we start from Aristotle's old dictum that all human beings by nature desire to know, and then we add, but they don't want to be told. They want to discover the truth for themselves. And we've found really one of the best ways to do that is through conversation. So today we're going to have a conversation with Peter Robinson. Many of you know Peter. He is the Murdoch Distinguished Policy Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He writes there about business and politics and edits Hoover's quarterly journal. And of course, many of you know him as the host of Hoover's wonderful program, Uncommon Knowledge. I myself am a fan, Peter, and a follower and a listener and a viewer of Uncommon Knowledge. I never miss one if I can help it. It's a wonderful program for those of you who are not yet regular viewers. Let me highly recommend it to you. It's Peter talking with some of the most interesting and important thinkers, scholars, writers, public figures with really probing and interesting questions that get below the surface and kind of reveal their thoughts on some of the most important issues of the day. So thank you for that service to the country and to knowledge, Peter. We really do appreciate that. And Peter's education, bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College, and also served on the board of trustees of Dartmouth College, his alma mater, went on for an additional bachelor's degree at Oxford University, and then completed his master's in business administration from Stanford University. Along the way, Peter has been the author of a number of really fine books that I would commend to your interest. One particular, I think, for this webinar is entitled, How Ronald Reagan Changed My Life. It's a wonderful story, a wonderful read. Let me recommend all of you get a copy of it and take a look. Mr. Robinson, of course, many of us know him as a speechwriter in the Reagan administration, where he began as a speechwriter for Vice President George H.W. Bush, and then moved to be a speechwriter for President Reagan for a number of years. And I think the story of how he became a speechwriter in the White House is a fascinating one, a really interesting one. He himself describes it as a fluke, and I hope we can talk a little bit more about that. And of course, though, today, the topic of our webinar and our conversation together is the very famous speech in 1987 in front of the Berlin Wall. And I thought to get us started, perhaps we could just play a short 2-minute clip of some of the highlights of that speech.
And now the Soviets themselves may, in a limited way, be coming to understand the importance of freedom. We hear much from Moscow about a new policy of reform and openness. Some political prisoners have been released. Certain foreign news broadcasts are no longer being jammed. Some economic enterprises have been permitted to operate with greater freedom from state control. Are these the beginnings of profound changes in the Soviet state, or are they token gestures intended to raise false hopes in the West or to strengthen the Soviet system without changing it? We welcome change and openness. for we believe that freedom and security go together, that the advance of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Peter, those have become, as you know, iconic lines from one of the most important speeches of the post-war era in the 20th century by an American president. But the story behind the speech is fascinating, and I'm sure not all of our listeners have heard it. Tell us the story behind the speech, how you came to be a speechwriter for President Reagan, and then in particular, writing that speech with that line.
Jeff, thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me. You run an institution that takes Aristotle as its point of departure, and that means you are a lucky man. And also, I want to apologize to everybody. I'm speaking to you from California, and nobody in California has worn a necktie in at least a decade. So, and I am sorry to say, I've just gotten a little bit sloppy myself. Final point here is, I may as well admit it. I'm at home. I'm in the spare bedroom. There are 2 dogs on the bed behind me asleep. So I'm using a fake background here. How I got to be a speechwriter in the White House. After I graduated from Dartmouth, where incidentally I knew Rob Portman. Rob Portman and I, your junior senator, Rob Portman. Rob and I have been friends all these years, but I have to say, it is difficult to get used to the idea that a man you have seen misbehave in a fraternity basement is now a member of the United States Senate. All right.
We'll keep those stories for another time.
Yes, all right, that's fine. Yes, actually, that would give me an opportunity to shake Rob down. For $1,000, I won't tell the stories. From Dartmouth to Oxford, 2-year academic program at Oxford, and then I decided to stay in Oxford for a 3rd year. I rented a little cottage, 500 years old, £5 a week, to write a novel. And I got halfway into it, and it was so bad that even I couldn't read it. So I wrote letters to everybody I could think of who might be able to give me a lead on a job. I was an English major at Dartmouth. I'd gone to Oxford. I'd had a good time, but I was not particularly employable. One of the very few people who replied was William F. Buckley, who said, who had been kind enough to notice my writing when I wrote for the Daily Dartmouth. He paid a lot of, he loved Yale, his own alma mater, but for reasons, honestly, I never quite figured out. He also paid attention to Dartmouth. In any event, Bill said, you like writing and you like politics. This is now 1982. Go to Washington, see if you can get a job as a speechwriter in the new administration, and get in touch with my son, Christopher. Christopher Buckley was then writing speeches for Vice President George H.W. Bush. I presented myself to Christopher, thinking he might be able to get me a job writing speeches for the Postmaster General or maybe some member of Congress. And Christopher said, well, now, wait a minute. I'm leaving this job in 2 weeks and my replacement just fell through. Let me talk to people here. While you're in the building, this was what was then called the old executive building, office building, old executive office building right next to the White House. He said, go downstairs and talk to Tony Dolan. Tony was then chief speechwriter for the president. And while I was in Tony's office introducing myself, his phone rang. It was the campaign chairman for Lou Lehrman. Nobody will remember this, but Lou Lehrman, a great figure. He ran for governor of New York against Mario Cuomo and came within 3 points of knocking Cuomo out. In any event, I heard Tony saying to the phone, "Oh, you need a speechwriter." Well, as it happens, I have one standing right here. Christopher Buckley and Tony Dolan were friends, and they hatched a plot. Christopher told the vice president's people that he found the perfect replacement for himself, me, but that they'd better move quickly because Lou Lehrman wanted to hire me. And Tony told Lou Lehrman's people that they should hire me, but they had to move fast because George H.W. Bush's people wanted to hire me. For 2 weeks, I was in this, Lou Lehrman flew me to New York for interviews 3 times. I was in and out of the White House for interviews. And I decided, both made offers. And I decided to go to work for the vice president just because I thought he had greater job security. Lou Lehrman might lose that autumn, as he did, unfortunately, but George Bush would be safe in his job until at least 1984. So nobody asked whether I had ever written a speech, which was good for me because I never had. So I joined the vice president's staff. That's how I tumbled into the White House. 2 years later, there were openings on the president's staff, and they hired me because I was already in the building. That should not inspire confidence in the federal government. One more story about why we should want less of that organization.
That's right. So much for vetting.
Right. So much for vetting, exactly. The
So
vice
how
president.
do you come then, once you're on Ronald Reagan's
Yes.
speechwriting staff, how do you come, and that would have been in 83, 84, is that right?
I joined his staff in October 83.
Okay.
And then the Berlin Wall. So I'd written by 1987, by the spring of 1987, I'd written a lot of speeches. Ronald Reagan spoke a lot. We tend to remember full dress speeches now, inaugural addresses, State of the Union addresses, but he'd give brief remarks in the Rose Garden several times a week. He'd speak to conferences that were meeting in hotel ballrooms in Washington, D.C. There was a lot. He was good at speaking. It was easy for him, by contrast with some presidents, Richard Nixon, George W. Bush. Preparing and delivering a speech took a lot out of them, so they didn't do that many. It was a big draw on their schedule. For President Reagan, still, this shows something. All these years later, I still say the president. There's one president in my mind. Anyway, so he gave a lot of them, and that meant that I'd written a lot by then. And I just got that speech because there was a sort of informal arrangement on the staff. There were 5 or 6 presidential speechwriters at any given time that we would each get a big speech each year. There were so many little things to write that we would sort of share out the big speeches. And I was next up for a big speech. So Tony Dolan assigned me to write the speech in Berlin. That's how I got the speech. That's how I got the assignment, I should say.
And then
pure happenstance.
Amazing. So then when you're given the speech, how do you begin to prepare for the speech and the actual writing of it for the president?
Well, here is the direction that I received from Tony, who received it from the senior staff. We knew we knew the site of the speech. He was going to be speaking in front of the Berlin Wall. We knew that the audience would number somewhere between 10 and 40,000. In the end, it happened to be at the high end of that. It was about 40,000 people there that day. And given the location, he should speak about foreign policy. That was it.
That's it.
That was it. That was the guidance we got. And so to gather material, I went on what was called a pre-advance trip. Why it was a pre-advance, I don't know. You'd think there's advance in any event. So a plane load of White House staffers flew over to Europe. These would be people who are going to sort out the hotel arrangements, the security, press people who would make sure there were good camera angles at every place the president would speak. That was actually quite a delightful trip because the president was going to go to Italy. He was going to go to Rome and then to Venice for an economic summit before flying to Berlin. And he would only spend half a day in Berlin. So I was along for the trip in Rome and Venice and had nothing to do except see the sights, all of the courtesy of the American taxpayer. in any event, I made this trip, and in Berlin, Berlin, I came alive because that was my assignment, and we spent a day and a half in Berlin, as I recall. So I was just scheduled quite tightly. One, went to the place where the president would speak, and I remember that because I felt I was in real trouble. I find now it's very hard to convey what it felt like to stand at the Berlin Wall now that it's been gone for years. But to stand there, we climbed an observation platform. We could look into East Berlin, and soldiers, very few pedestrians, all the buildings looked in poor repair. And then behind you in West Berlin, you have a modern city with color and people bustling and recent model year cars. And then off to one side was the Reichstag, which at that point was just a museum, a very seldom visited museum. And it was in almost the same condition it was at the end of the war, meaning you could still see the damage from shelling. So you had this feeling of there's communism right there. And you can see with your, not only could you see it, you could feel it. It was as if the air itself had extra weight. It was just a place of such weight and moment. Crosses at the foot of the Berlin Wall where people had died trying to escape. So I just thought, oh my goodness, what material can I possibly come up with that I can give to the president that will equal the setting? What can I give him? So from there to the office of a man called John Kornblum, who later became our ambassador to Germany, but who at that point was the consul general, as I recall, that was his title. In any event, he was the ranking American diplomat in Berlin. And he was full of ideas, but they were all useless because they were ideas about what the president shouldn't say. Kornblum, State Department official, concerned about a visit to his city from Ronald Reagan, no commie bashing. People who live here are surrounded by East Germany. They're very sensitive to the nuance required in East-West relations. We've got major universities here in West Berlin. They're the same as universities elsewhere. They're left-leaning. Oh, and by the way, don't make a big deal about the wall. They've gotten used to it by now. It's part of the scene here. So I walked out of that meeting in a sense with negative material. I had items in my notebook that the president should not say. Next event, I was given a flight in a US Army helicopter over the Berlin Wall, and my troubles deepened because from the air, you could see what lay on the other side of the wall, dog runs, guard towers, and it was, again, just that feeling of being surrounded by it. It's very hard to convey the feeling, but at the same time, I wouldn't be doing it justice if I didn't say that you just felt that there was a kind of malignant presence.
Almost the feeling of oppression.
Absolutely, you could feel it. You could feel, honestly, the place that I've found the best description of what that felt like is in The Lord of the Rings, when Frodo looks upon Mordor. It really, of course, that sounds ridiculous and melodramatic, but you felt something, and it wasn't good. And then that evening, fourth and final stop for me in Berlin, that evening I broke away from the American Party and got into a taxi and went out to a suburban area, residential area of West Berlin. And there, a German couple put on a dinner party for me. The couple and I had never met, but we had friends in common back in Washington because the husband in this couple, Dieter Eltz, who just died 18 months ago, I guess it must have been, had been at the World Bank in Washington, and then he had retired back to Germany. So they just brought together friends of theirs so that I could meet some Berliners. And the one rule was that everybody had to speak English. So Dieter was an economist. His wife, Ingeborg, had been a housekeeper and mother all her life. There was a physician. There was someone who taught economics, as I recall, at the Free University in Berlin. The Eltzes had their children. There were 2 or 3 students there. So we've got maybe 15 people, 18 people, and there's small talk. And finally I thought, and bear in mind, I was in trouble at this point. I was really worried. And I wanted to get to the bottom of it somehow. So I said, look, I've been told that you've all gotten used to the wall by now. The president's going to be speaking in front of the wall. I flew over it today. It just seems to me hard to imagine that you could have gotten used to it, but you live here, I don't. Is that so? Have you gotten used to it? And I remember there was just the conversation stopped. Silence. And I thought, I may even have blushed. I really felt embarrassed. I felt certain that I had committed some kind of gaffe, just the kind of gaffe that the diplomat wanted the president to avoid, right? And then one man raised his arm and pointed. And he said, my sister lives just a few kilometers in that direction. Just a few kilometers. I haven't seen her in more than 20 years. How do you think we feel about that wall? Well, then they started talking about it, and it was clear that they hated it. They'd stop talking about it to each other. What else could be said? But if you asked, you found out that they still hated it. And Gorbachevs, the hostess, who's a very gracious lady, she died perhaps 3 years ago now. We became good friends over the years after this event. But she became quite angry, and she said, if this man Gorbachev is serious with this talk, glasnost, perestroika, he can prove it by coming here and dismantling this wall. And that went into my notebook. I felt immediately that if the president had been there in my place, and my job, of course, was just to examine things with his eyes, to listen with his ears as best I could, that he would have responded to that remark, the decency, the simplicity of it. So that went into my notebook. And then I went back to Washington and adapted that and built the speech around that remark.
How does that remark uttered in that dinner party in West Berlin, how does it come into the speech, and then the story of how it stays in the speech?
Right. Well, there were the usual writer's agonies, which I find people get quite impatient if I try to tell them, you have no idea what writers suffer, because writers seem to lead pretty cushy lives. The first week back, Tony Dolan, I went to Tony immediately and said, I think I want to put in a call to tear down I told him the story, and he said, great. And then we walked immediately over from the old executive office building to see a fellow called Tom Griscom, who was our boss as the director of communications. By the way, you need to bear in mind here, the sort of small bore politics of the White House matter in the story of this speech, although I promise I won't go on and on about it. But Don Reagan had left as chief of staff. He and his support staff had left only weeks before. And Howard Baker was the new chief of staff. Tommy Griscom had been with Howard. Tommy Griscom was himself from Tennessee, from Chattanooga, and he'd been with Senator Baker, which everyone continued to call him Senator Baker. He'd been with Senator Baker for years, so he knew the chief of staff well. What he didn't know was White House procedures terribly well, but he knew the press. And he said, okay, this is going to be the line in that speech. And he said, okay, I'm with you. So I went through draft after draft after draft. And at one point I put in the central call. There was a problem because the viewing audience at home on television would be American, of course, but he was going to have 10 to 40,000 Germans in front of him. So I wanted to put something in German. So I put the central line, Herr Gorbachev, machen Sie dieser Tor auf. And Tony Dolan looked at this and said, Peter, when your client is the president of the United States, give him his best lines in English. So,
of course.
Monkeying. All right. Then came a moment, good grief, it was just a year ago now. Just 30 some years ago. It was May, it was a Friday. I'd finished a draft, The other speechwriters had hurried to finish their drafts of remarks the president would make when he met the Pope, when he met the president of Italy, when he got to the Venice Economic Summit. And we went over to the White House as the helicopter was landing on the South Lawn to take the president to Camp David. And the staff secretary, who again was new, I wasn't there, but the speech representative of our office said to him, look, the president has a big bundle of speeches. This is a lot. You better just give it to him right now so he can review the material over the weekend at Camp David and get ahead of it a little bit. And the staff secretary was reluctant. And of course, the important point here is that in the Reagan White House, speeches went out to staffing before they went to the president. And the staff secretary sort of knew that, but wasn't sure what he should do in this situation. And then I am told, lo and behold, the president appeared walking out to the helicopter, and he glanced over and the staff secretary gave him the bundle of speeches. And he worked for me, and he handed it to him. The important point is that the president saw the draft before it went out to staffing. The following Monday, which I do recall, that was May 18th, 1987. So we're off that anniversary by just 24 hours here. But we had a meeting, we speechwriters had a meeting with the president in the Oval Office. We went around the room. There were 6 of us speechwriters, Tommy Griscom, the president. And we went through all the speeches that he would give in Rome and then Venice. And then we got to the draft I had written. And Tommy Griscom said, Mr. President, Peter's speech, Berlin, any thoughts? And the president just said, well, that was a good draft. That's a good speech, which was, I'd worked so hard. We always wanted more of Reagan. And the way Tommy worked it was that if there was time, each of us could ask a question, try to elicit more from the president. So I said, Mr. President, I learned when I was in Berlin that they'd be able to hear your speech on the communist side of the wall. Maybe even, depending on weather conditions, as far east as Moscow. They may be able to pick it up by radio, even in Moscow. Is there anything in particular you want to say to people on the communist side? And the president said, well, there's that part about tearing down the wall. That's what I want to say to them. That wall has to come down. Boom. And then it went out to staffing. But the miracle of it was that the president had singled out that passage in front of staff as something he especially wanted to deliver. So for the 3 weeks from that meeting until the president delivered the speech, the State Department and the National Security Council made run after run after run at that speech. I got yanked into meetings. They tried hard to talk Tommy Griscom into overruling, Tommy Griscom and Tony Dolan into overruling me. They tried hard to talk me into changing my mind. We just said no. And Tommy told me he got yanked into a meeting. The chief of staff, Senator Baker, didn't like the line. He thought it bothered him. He couldn't say why exactly, but he thought it was unpresidential. But George Shultz, the Secretary of State, objected to the line. And he thought it would put Gorbachev in a difficult position in the Politburo. And Tommy Griscom said, well, Mr. Secretary, the president himself has said to us that he especially wants to deliver that passage. So the central point here is that nobody took that back to the president himself. They leaned on the speechwriters. And I was 30 years old and really didn't know much about anything. But I remember Colin Powell, who was number 2 on the National Security Council then, shouted at me and chewed me out. And you know what I did? I shouted right back at him. Who knows? Who knows where that came from? And then on I was not part of the traveling party, so I wasn't in Europe. But on the day they traveled from Venice to West Berlin, the State Department faxed onto Air Force One, I think it was the 7th or 8th alternative draft that they produced, missing the line to tear down the wall. And Ken Duberstein was the deputy chief of staff. He was in the limousine on the way to West Berlin and with the president. And the president said, explained that he was going to give the speech as it had been written. And then he said, the boys at State are going to kill me for this, but it's the right thing to do. So that's how it stayed in. Wow. It was, yeah.
The arguments against it that you were hearing from State, and that you were hearing from the NSC? As you said, it would put Gorbachev in a difficult spot with the Politburo. They thought it would be too aggressive. Is that it, given the situation with U.S.-Soviet relations at the time?
There were layers and layers of objections. The answer is yes, more or less. Honestly, though, Howard Baker, one of the few men, years later, he and I ran into each other at an event at the Reagan Library. And Howard Baker, whatever else he was an honest man and a kind man. And he said, you know, I have never been so happy to be wrong about anything as I was to be wrong about that speech. But it didn't sit right with him. He didn't even really he couldn't explain why. He said he thought it sounded unpresidential. And honestly, looking back on it over all these years, the reasoning they provided wasn't really that compelling. It didn't sit right with them because they were trained diplomats, and you didn't let your principal say anything that sounded so provocative, so direct, so unsettling. I mean, think of what your Soviet counterparts were going to be on the phone to you complaining about the very next day. Really, it was large. And then it turned out, I did not know this until after I wrote the speech. John Kornblum had written a draft himself. So the State Department thought that they could take control of the speech. Tony Dolan, my boss, God bless him, didn't even let me know. He protected me even from the knowledge that there was another draft circulating, because then I would have asked to see it and I would have State Department pros in Tony just didn't even want me to know it existed. So there's meeting after meeting after meeting. And part of what's going on is they just want in. It's a huge event. They've invested untold hours in negotiating the location. And in the end, Tony's having all these meetings and he comes back to me and we insert, I guess it was a page and a half or 2 pages of State Department stuff. So if you continued listening to the speech after that 2 minutes you played, Jeff, you would hear it go flat for a little while, because that's where the president talks about this initiative, that initiative. Someday in the future, East and West Berlin may be able to share the Olympics, and we may be able to negotiate increased flyover rights to West Berlin over East Germany. And these were all sort of little small bore initiatives that the guys at State and the NSC had spent hours and hours and hours negotiating. They just felt it was their property. And every time they submitted an alternative draft, Tommy Griscom and Tony Dolan and I would look at it and we realized we can't permit the president to, it's just boring, bureaucratic. I mean, forgive me, they were highly skilled. We were on the same side, essentially, but they were professional diplomats. And you couldn't put Ronald Reagan in front of the Berlin Wall and fail to have him say, this is an outrage. You can't just put him in the Berlin Wall and say, someday maybe we can have Olympics on both sides of this wall. You couldn't do that. So I'm sorry if that may not answer your question, but so the notion that it might put Gorbachev in a tight spot in the Politburo, I am sure that if they had intelligence, real evidence that Gorbachev was under threat from this or that figure, that's the kind of thing they would have taken to the president. Tommy and it was just talk. It was just talk. If they had anything serious, they'd have gone to the president. They just wanted to be their speech. They wanted it to sound the way they thought it should sound. And they wanted it to be directed at their audience, which was fellow diplomats.
But
that's my reading on it. All these years later, that's what really was going on. It's human beings.
Right. And these territorial schools within the White House.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But you listened to what your hostess said at that dinner party and said, that sounds, I think you put it, in its simplicity and dignity, like something Ronald Reagan would say. Help us understand how you as a speechwriter came to understand and get into the mind of Ronald Reagan and hear the words that would sound right to him and that wouldn't sound right to him.
That may be in some ways the most important question you can ask any of us who served as speechwriter for Reagan. I can tell you what happened. I can't tell you how it happened because it was just, even now it strikes me as almost weird. Here's what you have to bear in mind, and you really do have to bear this in mind. If our listeners come away from this with nothing else but this is what they need to bear in mind. Ronald Reagan was the man. So by contrast, here's a contrast. You get George W. Bush becoming president. And one thing he and his speechwriters have to do is invent the sound of his voice. He hasn't given that many speeches. He doesn't know what he sounds like. Ronald Reagan had been speaking in public since at least 1948, when he headed an organization called Hollywood for Truman. In those days, he was, by his own account, a liberal Democrat, not just a Democrat, but a liberal Democrat. Of course, a liberal Democrat was a different thing in 1948 from what it became later. Still, then as president of the Screen Actors Guild, he was speaking constantly. As governor, he spoke constantly. And by the way, right through this period, even when he was governor, Lynn Nofziger and Peter Flanagan told me that Reagan continued to write about half of his material himself. After stepping down as leaving out, his movie career fizzles out. He becomes a spokesman for General Electric and begins touring plants across the country. So by the time Ronald Reagan becomes president, and by the way, the other bit about this that's tremendously important is, in my opinion, he grows up in the middle of the country. His first big break is as a radio announcer in the Midwest. He gets a job with Warner Brothers when he's still in his 30s. When he goes to on the strength of one screen test, he gets hired. And he appeared in something like 30 movies in his first 3 years in Hollywood. The president used to say they didn't want them good, they wanted them Thursday. And so what's going on here? His audience is always ordinary Americans. This is not a man who spent 10 minutes in the faculty lounge at any fancy pants university in his life. It's always ordinary Americans. He didn't pay, he also used to say that what the critics wrote about the films was not important. What mattered was box office. You wanted to appeal to people who wanted to be entertained and moved. Okay, so you get this professional training of Ronald Reagan. Incidentally, it also comes out, Marty Anderson and Annalise Anderson published a book, this would be 15 years after the administration ended, called Reagan in His Own Hand. And they discovered that while he was president, he wrote in his own hand something like 8,000 letters. Overwhelmingly, these were to ordinary Americans. The correspondence office at the White House would give him 10 or 12, of course they received thousands of letters a week, but they'd give him 10 or 12 letters from ordinary people that they thought were in one way or another representative. He wanted to hear what people felt. He would take these letters to Camp David, and very often he would answer them by hand. So the dentist in Moline pops off about Reagan's economic policy, and a week later he has an answer from the President of the United States sitting in his mailbox. He's not writing, he did write a few to world leaders. He and Bill Buckley kept up a correspondence. But what's striking about this is that the letters in their thousands are to ordinary Americans, not to famous people, not to campaign backers or supporters. Okay, so by the time speechwriters come along, we know what he sounds like, and he knows and we know where he stands. And we know the audience that matters to Ronald Reagan, frankly, is not the State Department. It's ordinary Americans. We know all that. And we read what he's written and listen to his speeches. And the rule in the White House was that if you wrote a speech the president delivered, you went to hear it so that you could see how he handled the material. You could see if he ad-libbed in person. You could see if there was a passage that was a little too serious that he wanted to break up with a joke. You just watched him work. And so this is the part that still strikes me as kind of strange. Over 8 years, there were 14 of us who had the job of speechwriter to the president, 5 or 6 at a time. And of course, there's some turnover. So it turns out to be 14 different people. For all 8 years, Ronald Reagan sounded like one person, Ronald Reagan. And that was because we all had a mark we were writing to. We could all hear him. We talk about the mind's eye. There's a mind's ear as well. We could all hear him as we wrote. I could go on about that, but I probably already said too much.
No,
but the point here is that it was Reagan. There was no clever speechwriter. It was Ronald Reagan.
You also, in that speech, captured Reagan's understanding of America and the Soviet Union in the Cold War, because we think of him as a principled leader in his opposition to communism, which he had from decades and decades of conviction and reading and thinking,
right.
And which he was perfectly willing to articulate. Were you thinking about that and Reagan's the feeling of oppression you had at the Berlin Wall, of course? Were you also thinking about, what does Ronald Reagan think about Soviet communism? How does he understand America and its position in the world against the evil of communism? Was that also in your mind?
Oh, sure. All this is in my mind. Now, the one thing, so again, we knew where he stood. We knew what he felt about communism. The speech, what was the one aspect, the one place where the speech was saying something new, was that it was a response to Gorbachev. Gorbachev had been talking about perestroika and glasnost, and there had been no formal response. Excuse me, maybe the diplomats had responded in memorandum, I don't know. But there hadn't been a response from the president to this notion of glasnost and perestroika, to this notion that Gorbachev was something new, that things were changing in the Soviet Union. And I have to say, I believe that the president, trust but verify was what the president always said. I believe the president was suspicious, and I knew I was suspicious. You stand there at the Berlin Wall and look into East Berlin and say to yourself, Gorbachev is getting good press? That son of a bitch is responsible for this. What? Okay, so that was why that comment from Ingeborg Eltz struck me as so powerful. Oh, things are changing in the Soviet Union? Oh, you're a new kind of leader? Listen, Buster, prove it. Prove it. Easy to do. Come here. So I felt, that felt to me right. And it, above all, it felt right to what the president would want to say. And then, of course, he reads it at Camp David, and it felt right to him, too.
So he had that, you're working so closely with him, that kind of resolve to stick to those words that struck him as simple and clear, and there was a kind of moral clarity to them, right?
Yes,
yes.
You're
saying that people in West Berlin and what we know now, dissidents in Eastern Europe, cheered when they heard that kind of moral clarity from a president of the United States. That was the way. Richard Nixon, you have tumblers going in the mind all the time. He and Henry Kissinger they're making very fine calculations constantly. That's not the way Ronald Reagan's, and by the way, I don't mean to, the opening to China, all kinds of things are remarkable and commendable about that kind of mind and what it achieved in that era. But that's not the way Ronald Reagan had a kind of moral imagination. He could see he was the first person who really believed. Well, Dick Allen, was just exchanging emails with Dick the other day. 1977, Reagan hasn't announced for president. He's stepped down as governor. He's lost to Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination. Jimmy Carter's president. Nobody knows what Reagan's going to do, probably not even Reagan at that point. But Dick Allen stopped by the house in Pacific Palisades and gave the president, or the former governor, a briefing on world affairs. And then Dick said, Nancy brought them some sandwiches, and over lunch, the former governor said, well, Dick, would you like to hear my theory of the Cold War? And Dick Allen's just given him this learned disquisition. And Dick said, well, yes, of course, Governor, I'd like to hear your theory. And Reagan said, well, some people think it's simplistic, but there's a difference between being simple and being simplistic. My theory of the Cold War is we win
and they lose. I mean, as simple and powerful. And there was not enough. And Dick Allen said he worked for Nixon, he'd studied Kissinger. There was no other figure, literally no other figure at the top of American political life who would have said that. Likewise, 10 years later, there was no other figure for whom I would have drafted that speech or who would have overruled the foreign policy apparatus to deliver it.
That's amazing. That kind of moral clarity and courage.
Right. Yes, all of that.
You worked many years closely with President Reagan. We know about him, those of us who have seen him from the outside, and his sort of public persona, affable, cheerful, optimistic in his character. What was Reagan like in private? Was he the same man, or did you see different sides of him?
He was identical. There was no, is this true? I think I can truly say that he's the only person in public life I've ever known for whom there was just no difference between the public man and the private man. Now, what you did see, if you watched him over time in the White House, was a paradox that was really kind of a defining paradox of Ronald Reagan. And it was this. Actually, though, even this isn't private information. You could see this if you watched him in public as well. That this man who is so avuncular and so serene and so affable, I can't think of a single meeting, including meetings where we just trooped over to have our annual photograph taken, the White House speechwriting staff, the annual photograph with the president. Every single time he would begin with a joke. He wanted everybody to be at ease. Okay. At the same time, he was steel. Why didn't anybody from the State Department go up to President Reagan and say, listen, Mr. President, we just think you'd be making a mistake with this passage. Didn't really want to cross him. There's a famous event, 81, I think it was, when the president was eliminating Jimmy Carter's so-called two-track INF policy. This goes way back, it gets complicated, I won't. But the Soviets had deployed intermediate range nuclear forces across Eastern Europe. And Carter's two-track was, we negotiate with them, and then if things don't go well, we might start to deploy some of our own. And Reagan set that aside for the so-called 0-0 option. If they remove every missile they've deployed, taking it to zero, we will promise not to deploy any of our own, keeping it at zero. And Paul Nitze, who is the very distinguished diplomat, brilliant man, but he said, Mr. President, you are asking the Soviets to tear up an investment of billions of rubles in return for which we will agree not to spend $1. I don't even know how to convey that to my Soviet counterpart. And Ronald Reagan said, well, Paul, you just tell the Soviets you work for one tough son of a bitch. And he was that. He was that. He was the sweetest son of a bitch you'd ever meet, but don't cross him on matters of principle. Don't do it.
Did you ever see him angry in those situations or show his frustration?
I saw the steel, but even then it was conveyed in a very avuncular, friendly way. Ed Meese, who of course knew Reagan much better than almost anybody else, said he only saw Reagan really angry 3 or 4 times. And in each instance, he would take off his reading glasses and whip them across the room. And every time it was for the same reason, that the staff had scheduled him so tightly that he was forced to keep someone waiting. He didn't like to appear to be rude. That's what made him angry. Okay. There was this, Jeff, I'm not sure I'll get the timing of this right, but it doesn't matter. The story is right. This is earlier than the Berlin speech. The then head of presidential speechwriting, Ben Elliott, wrote a speech in which he included material on abortion. And he included the statement that as medicine advanced, we understood that unborn children, that fetuses were viable and indeed could feel pain, much earlier than we had supposed. Okay. And there's an uproar. 2 weeks later, Robinson gets assigned to write a speech for the National Association of Evangelicals. And I meet their representatives and they say, and I said, what would your people like to hear the president address? Foreign policy? What? And they said, look, I remember this vividly. They actually said this. Our people love Ronald Reagan so much he could read the telephone book. But if he didn't mention his pro-life stand, they'd feel something was missing. Okay. So I used similar material to what Ben Elliott had used in my draft. We troop into the Oval Office for the speech meeting. And again, for only the second time in this is just occurring to me. There had been a changeover in personnel. David Gergen had left. You don't care about these. Nobody cares about this, but one communications director had left, and Dick Darman had just taken over as communications director, and he had let my speech go to the president before seeing it himself. It had gotten through to the president. So there we are in the speech meeting, and Dick Darman is there, which was normal, but so was Jim Baker, which was not. The chief of staff in a speech meeting. And then we got to my draft, and Baker said nothing. Then we got to my draft, and the president said, well, I like this, I like that. And then Dick Darman said, Jim, I think you have a thought or two on this speech, on Robinson's speech. And Jim Baker said, Mr. President, that's right, it was 84, he's going into re-election. Mr. President, you're going into a tough re-election period. The polls are against you on abortion. We need to get you re-elected so you can appoint good justices to the Supreme Court. But in the meantime, my view is that let's drop this language and insert language on school prayer. It will have the same effect, reassuring that these people that you share their values. And I was looking at Ronald Reagan through all this, and Reagan just smiled and shook his head as though Jim Baker was trying to bamboozle him. And Ronald Reagan said, well, Jim, you know the way I feel about this issue. And he said, come to think of it. And he stood up and walked over to the desk in the Oval Office, and he said, here it is. He said, just the other day, I got this letter. And he read the letter. Dear Mr. President, we, the undersigned medical doctors, want you to understand that in your speech on fetal viability, you were exactly correct. Sincerely, and it was signed by 20 people, everyone with an MD afterwards. And the president walked over. As he walked back to his chair, he dropped the letter in Dick Darman's lap. And he said, maybe we should mention that letter in this speech. And then he sat down. And Baker and Darman went white with anger. Of course, they didn't say anything, but they went white with anger. And Darman called me in the next morning and chewed me out. He fired me, actually. For about 10 seconds, I was fired. He unfired me, but he just, okay. So that was the way Ronald Reagan tended to handle something. You can imagine Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon if a staffer crossed them. Reagan just sort of, oh, really, fellas? Well, no, I don't think so. That was the way he handled it.
Wow. What quality about President Reagan in your work with him over those many years, what quality surprised you the most about him?
His hard work. He did make it look easy.
He had a reputation in the press, at least, of sort of take very easygoing days, a short working day, breaking for, Wednesday afternoons and that sort of thing.
Right. He did put in short days in the Oval Office, and he would often head back to the residence. There were sometimes nap times scheduled in. They never appeared on the schedule, of course, on the official schedule. And he would head back sometimes at 4, sometimes at 5. Of course, bear in mind, we're dealing with a man who is in his 70s, and in those days, being in your 70s was quite old. We're also dealing with a man who'd almost been killed in an assassination attempt. So there's a certain physical limitation that he's facing. But when it came to the contrast, again, I worked for Vice President Bush as he was then, and I'd send in a speech and he just wouldn't look at it. Quite often, being on Air Force Two, and you'd feel the plane begin to descend. And then I would get the call that the vice president wanted me into the forward cabin, because he very often wouldn't look at a speech until delivering it was the next thing he had to do. If you look at old films of Vice President Bush giving a speech, you can see from time to time a look of surprise. And that's because he's seeing it for the first time himself. Okay, Reagan, speeches go to the president, typically at least 48 hours before he delivers them. And they come back to us the next, and yes, he's left the office at Oval Office at 4 o'clock, but he always carries work home with him. And always the speeches get marked up and returned to us the next day. And sometimes they're edited fairly heavily. And sometimes I can remember going in for I'd written a speech, I got it back from the president, it said RR in the upper right-hand corner, which meant he'd looked at it. For some reason, I can remember it was a 6-page set of remarks. No comments first page, none on the second, none on the third. I thought, oh, for once he just didn't bother. Last page, second to last line, he changed one word, which had an effect. The effect was, this man is always paying attention to our work. So the steadiness, he understood his job was to make a couple decisions a day, to feel relaxed, to project a certain optimism. He was not Jimmy Carter, who was scheduling the White House tennis courts. He was perfectly happy to delegate, but the central decisions were his. And between him and above all Mrs. Reagan, he remained rested so that he could rested, clear-headed, pleasant, affable. He paced himself, but the work was constant, was steady. He was actually a very disciplined man.
As we come to the end of our time here, it's been amazingly quick passing. Tell us, if you wouldn't mind, because you've had this experience. We've had a number of students want to know the answer to this question. What advice would you give to young people who are interested in a career in public affairs or going into public service of some kind, particularly in speech writing? Don't say don't do it.
Well, all right. Aside from what I'm not allowed to say, I do have some advice. First of all, put my example entirely out of your mind, because I did end up in the White House on a fluke. It is unreproducible. If it just happened, it either proves that there is a God, or if you take the other view, that there isn't a God. But it was a strange event one way or the other. If you really want to get into politics, work on a campaign. Volunteer if you have to. Campaigns are like scientists doing genetic experiments on fruit flies. Everything is speeded up. And campaigns are utterly ruthless. At the beginning of a campaign, certain people have certain titles, certain prestige. In the heat of a campaign, it doesn't matter what your title is or what prestige you had at the start. Can you deliver is all that matters. And so a talented kid can get the attention. The other bit, of course, is that candidates do two things in campaigns. They go places and they say things. So a speechwriter is in charge of roughly 50% of what the candidate has to do. So a campaign is a place to go if you can. The other thing I would do is, this sounds very pedestrian. I suppose in a certain sense it is pedestrian. I would get a notebook. Well, nobody uses notebooks these days. I would use some program, write the equivalent of a page a day, every single day without fail. So I guess the modern day equivalent of that would be use one of these programs where you start writing, and if you stop before 5 minutes has elapsed, it all disappears. Write every single day, and do not be critical of your writing. Writing involves two different, it wouldn't surprise me, by the way, now that we have brain imagery, if these two different functions took place in two different lobes of the brain, if they were somehow or other actually distinct in the human brain. But you have to shape your material. But the first thing a writer has to do is gather his own material, his or her own material. And I found it in my own life, but I see it in my own children, that just gathering the material can be so painful, difficult. You seize up and become anxious, that what you want is to just achieve fluency, so you don't worry about grammar or spelling. You say, today I'm going to describe a cloud, or today I'm going to say how angry I am with my cousin, or today I'm going to write down 10 things I don't know about economics. It doesn't matter, smart, stupid, good, bad. If anything, I'd put a little emphasis on being bad, just to give yourself freedom. The important thing is to begin to achieve fluency in gathering the material. That would be my advice.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Peter, so much for joining us. I mean, this
my
is
pleasure.
Wonderful conversation and insight into, well, how one captures the power of words, how one captures ideas and puts those into words for a human being like Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, it helps if it helps if you have Ronald Reagan. That's the other piece that's unreproducible, I'm afraid.
That's right. Well, thank you again, Peter, for joining us. And thank you all for being with us today for this conversation. We will be sending a link to a recording of this conversation. And we want to just please encourage you to send this to your children, to your grandchildren, to your friends, to your family, to your teachers. This is a wonderful, rare opportunity to get insight into a world historical making moment. For those of you who don't know anything or would like to know more about Ashbrook, check us out at ashbrook.org. For those of you who are students and especially teachers, our website, teachingamericanhistory.org or TAH.org, full of wonderful resources, including speeches by President Reagan. It's been great to have you for this conversation, all of you. We really believe at Ashbrook that through these conversations, we can gain some insight into the past and perhaps bring some of that insight here to our present time and renew our own understanding of America and its principles. And that always happens when you're talking about a figure like Ronald Reagan. And we understand that when you encounter a figure like that and his powerful words, it restores hope. It restores hope for the possibility and promise of America. So thank you again, Peter, for offering those words, which have brought hope to millions of people around the world. It's a special service to America and to humanity that you've offered. Thank you all for being with us. And as always, please stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay connected with Ashbrook. Thank you.